When Hades came out in 2020, it became all the rage really quickly, and for good reason. It had that beautiful art style in the isometric perspective that Supergiant games have become known for. But it was a far larger project than the developer had ever tried to make before. It had way more content, way more dialogue, and way more replayability. So unsurprisingly, it was their biggest game yet, and it was the first game that they'd ever made that they thought was worthy of a sequel. But if you consult the Steam reviews about it, they're not so impressed. Runs are samey, largely in part due to there being a limited pool of rooms and enemies. Fast-paced combat, really stale grind. This game would be an amazing visual novel, but it's too uninteresting and unchanging for a roguelike. I gave Aphrodite all of my nectar, but she doesn't okay. It's literally just room after room of enemies. That's it. That's the game. Okay. Let's just pick one. Let's just start with this one. The game would be an amazing visual novel. That's very much true. In fact, a huge chunk of the game practically is a visual novel. A ton of your time in the game is spent talking to characters, giving them gifts and seeing what they say and stuff like that. And this visual novel aspect does influence the roguelike gameplay very directly. Unlocking certain keepsakes and weapon aspects requires you to get certain lines of dialogue from certain characters, and these items can change gameplay drastically. So if you're not really the sort of person who's into the visual novel gameplay, you're gonna have a ton of text to spam past in order to actually get to the murdering things part of the game. But then a lot of these reviews seem to actually have the opposite complaint. They didn't want to do the roguelike part. They thought it was less interesting than the dialogue and the characters. They just want to see if they can romance Dusa or whatever. But the devs actually thought about this. They realized that these two types of gameplay aren't for everyone, but they both show importance in the game and they both directly influence each other. So they made sure that all of the text is 100% skippable. If you don't care whatsoever, you can just mash through the text. So long as you know what you have to do and in which order to get the correct dialogue to appear to unlock certain items, you don't actually have to spend any time reading it if you don't want to. Now, figuring out what you need to do to actually get the right dialogue to appear can be difficult if you're spam mashing through all the text like a monkey. But if you really don't care about the dialogue, the answer to that question is only a Google search away. And if you're more of a visual novel kind of guy, then there's just a big God mode button in the menu that lets you breeze through the entire roguelike portion of the game for free. So you can spend as little time as possible killing enemies so that you can get back to listening to what all the characters have to say. It's pretty clever, really. But this has a similar issue to assist mode from Celeste, an issue that I actually talked about when I read that game's negative reviews almost 2 years ago. Turning on a God mode for most players is just not an option. Even if they don't care about the roguelike part of the game whatsoever and they just want to see the story and the dialogue. Even if they're struggling with the portion of the game that they completely hate, they will never turn on God mode, because it feels like they're cheating, because it hurts their ego. And it's not even framed in the same way that Celeste's assist mode is either. It's literally called God mode. It's not using colourful language to hide the fact that you're cheating, it just straight up calls it God mode. Most players will never use this even if they know it's an option, because it makes them feel bad, because it hurts their ego. Oh, I actually don't know what this one says. Hang on. Oh. The other common thread here is that the game's repetitive. And honestly, you know, it kind of is. Wait. Relax, hang on. Wait, listen. Hear me out for a sec. It's not necessarily a repetitive game by default, but compared to literally any other roguelike I've ever played, it's pretty repetitive. Hades is a roguelike just like any other. You choose a character or a loadout. You find items along your run that make you stronger. You try and make those items as synergistic as possible, and then you fight the final boss. There's a ton of randomness, but the game gives you ways to have some amount of control over your runs, like choosing which item to get from a list, or what to buy from a shop, or scrapping and printing items to replace bad items with good ones. But Hades has less of this. Less of all of this. Hades has boons instead of items, and there are far less boons in Hades than there are items in most other roguelikes. And these boons are generally a lot more simplistic, with effects that are powerful but not necessarily particularly complicated. And this leads to far less variety in your runs. It does have the odd cool concept, like these Daedalus hammers, which change gameplay a ton, but these are quite rare and they don't actually come up in every single run. There are less areas, less enemy types, and the bosses are always the same every single time. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, but it does make Hades feel much more repetitive in comparison to other roguelikes out there. And with the sheer scope of Hades, it's unsurprising that there's less variety in the roguelike aspect of the game. The game is absolutely gigantic with how much dialogue there is and how many loadout items you can unlock. You can play for hundreds of hours without seeing everything. You could say that this game is, Supergiant. You die because the dash doesn't have iframes. Have fun. Okay, but the dash literally does have iframes? Like, it literally does. Like, look. Look what I just did. You see? You see? It does have iframes. There needs to be a mandatory IQ test before you can post a Steam review. So there's just one negative review that I found that's pretty much impossible to argue against, so I guess I'll just give you it. It's a pretty good point. The game is a masterpiece, but it has no colorblind settings. It becomes a visually indistinguishable mess after the second floor for someone like me who has issues differentiating blue and green. This one is completely inexcusable. Hades made Supergiant games silly amounts of money, so these sorts of basic accessibility options aren't really things that should be missing from a game like this. Although it is worth mentioning that at the time of leaving this review, this player had 19 hours in the game. But when I found the review, they have 154, which is pretty funny, actually. I mean, it's possible that they just found a mod or something that would enable a colorblind option, but if not, then I guess this guy is just a disgusting, filthy liar bastard. I don't know. There is a progression system to make you stronger, so I do not know if I am improving or the upgrade system is artificially making me better. Much of the gameplay ends up revolving around the out-of-run progression systems. Do you know, funnily enough, this is actually the biggest gripe that I had with Hades when I first played it myself, because I really liked the game, but the Mirror of Night felt completely shoehorned in, and it caused a bunch of issues for me. It doesn't feel right to me that you start the game out incredibly weak, and in 5 hours time, your chances to beat the game will have quadrupled just based on upgrades from the mirror alone. It makes the difficulty curve of the game look something like this, where the game starts off impossibly hard, but rapidly gets easier in the first few hours as you acquire mirror upgrades. Then the game starts to get harder again because you progress into more challenging areas of the game, just like any other game would have. I hated this a lot. In other roguelikes, you can theoretically go and beat the game instantly, and the only thing preventing this is your lack of knowledge and your lack of skill. But in Hades, you can still technically beat Hades on your first time, but your very first run is objectively more difficult than your first victorious run will be. It's quite a strange decision that I wasn't too sure I liked. Maybe if the game, like, scaled in such a way that it got harder as your upgrades improved, then maybe it'd be fine. But it didn't feel right to me to arbitrarily gate off new players from being able to succeed on their first run, because half of the modifiers on the Pact of Punishment are actually easier than just playing a fresh save file with no mirror upgrades. Just the ability to revive after dying a few times per run is completely and utterly crazy, and this alone will carry the majority of players in all of their runs. This upgrade alone makes the mirror a massive barricade for newer players, let alone all of the other stuff that's in the mirror. But you know what? I can forgive all that. I can forgive it being repetitive. I can forgive everything else. Out of all of the criticisms you can throw at Hades, some of them make sense. Some of them are completely garbage. There is, of course, only one thing about this game that well and truly makes it a 0 out of 10. A terrible video game. And that's, of course, that the poisonous rats shouldn't be more powerful than Hades. Why am I more likely to die to the stupid fucking sewer?